President.
The senator from Alaska.
Madam President,
The Senate is in a quorum call
request that proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. This afternoon, we will have before us, as members of the Senate, legislation that is entitled For the People Act. Before I speak to the For the People Act, Senate Bill 1, I want to make clear to colleagues that I have been keenly focused, interested in ensuring that when we have elections in this country, that they are free, they are fair, and they are accessible to all, that barriers to voting should be placed on the sidelines. For the past 3 sessions of Congress now, I have been the only co-sponsor of the Voting Rights Advancement Act. This was a measure that in prior Congresses was led by Senator Leahy, and I was pleased to be able to join him as a co-sponsor. That measure is now been introduced on the House side as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, a measure to basically reestablish the pre-clearance system, which was in place until 2013, and then it was pretty much upended with the Supreme Court ruling in Shelby. I certainly and absolutely intend to co-sponsor that measure again under its new name, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I will work with Senator Leahy. I will work with Senator Manchin. I will work with anybody on this initiative to help update this formula to ensure that we do have just exactly that, access to voting that is equal, that is fair, that is free from discrimination. Madam President, I note at the outset of my comments this morning the support for that legislation so that, again, folks understand that I fully understand that access to the ballot in this country is not perfect. And again, that I have stood behind legislation to ensure that our elections are fair. We've come a long way. We've come a long way, but I think we all recognize that there is a long path ahead of us. So let me turn to S1, the For the People Act. My fear is that this measure does not move us further down the path. If you look at the bill, it is wholly partisan. Unlike the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is very narrowly focused on voting rights, S1 has been described as sprawling. It's been described as ambitious, which is fair. Ambitious is not a bad thing, but it's clearly very broad. And it certainly contains some noteworthy goals, but I fear that there are provisions contained within S1s that take it too far, or that I think are bad policy, or that I simply think are beyond the power of Congress to regulate. My concern, and I've shared with many, is that the bill that we have in front of us is not so much about voting rights as it is a federal takeover of the election system, and a partisan federal takeover of the election system. The way the bill is being advertised, that somehow or other we can't count on states to do elections right or fairly, is a premise that I have a problem with. I come from a state where we were under preclearance for a long period of time. We recognize that. We had a history that was not one that I think we were proud of in terms of ensuring that there was fair and open, equal access to all. But what we have seen in the state and how we have worked through that process that was in place some years back is that we have come to this place where we have demonstrated that we can run a proper and an honest election. We've proven this time and time again. So much of my concern with what we have in front of us is that when you nationalize something, when you have kind of the federal overall oversight, it ends up being a one-size-fits-all mandate coming out of Washington, D.C. that in many cases doesn't work in a place like Alaska. There are certain aspects of S1 that I absolutely do support. Early voting. We shouldn't be limited to just the day of the election. I think we recognize that. What we can do to ensure that early voting is there, I think is important to us. I come from a state where you want to vote absentee, there is no excuse required. You can just vote absentee because it is more convenient to you. I will tell you, I was really surprised to find out how many states do not allow for that. I think that's something that we need to address. I am supportive of that. I think that we need to be doing more when it comes to ease of voter registration. And Again, in the state of Alaska, we have put in place ways to make it easier for folks to register. But again, I'm looking at what we have done in Alaska, proud of some of the measures that we have put in place, but I recognize that we did this without DC prescriptives or mandates of uniformity. So in walking through some of the concerns that I have, I mentioned making voter registration easier. Well, the We the People Act mandates automatic voter registration. Okay, maybe a good idea. In Alaska, what we have put in place is that Alaskans are automatically registered unless they specifically opt out. They're automatically registered to vote when they sign up for their permanent fund dividend. This is obviously very exclusive and unique to one state and one state alone. But under this measure that we have in front of us, it would require state election officials to automatically register any eligible unregistered citizen. So I'm looking at that and I'm saying, all right, well, if we allow for automatic registration with your PFD, there's a lot of Alaskans, believe it or not, that do not sign up for the PFD or that are not eligible for the PFD. So is the state going to have two different systems here in terms of how we meet this mandate? So I'm looking at it and I'm saying, well, that's a fair amount of federal micromanagement here. If a state wants to implement an automatic system, it should do so as Alaska did, but without the threat of the federal government kind of looming behind them, making sure that the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed in precisely the way the Election Assistance Commission thinks that they should be. I don't think we want to make the administration of elections involve even more burdensome effort, more costly. So it's something that you looked at and say, let's make sure that we can allow for easier registration, but let's not impose burdensome mandates. Early voting requirements. This is another issue within the bill. The bill requires at least 15 days of early voting. This is something, again, in Alaska that we all already do. Works great. But also requires that each polling place must be open for at least 10 hours a day. So we're basically back here in Washington, D.C., telling us in Alaska that you've got to have your polling place open for 10 hours a day. Think about this in context of a small community. And I'll take a super small community, Arctic Village. About 150 people total live there in the village, not 150 voters, but 150 people total. So it wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense for the state to maintain poll workers for at least 10 hours per day for at least 15 days in a community like Arctic Village. The whole town could practically vote in an hour, but that's not the point here. The point is you are imposing a federal mandate in a one-size-fits-all approach that just might not fit well there. One provision in the bill that I've got some significant concerns about is requiring same-day voter registration across the country. Again, in Alaska, we think that we've been doing a pretty fair job as to how we run our elections. I think it's reasonable that we be allowed to establish voter registration deadlines that work for the administrators in their respective states. I know some people are surprised, but the fact of the matter is we don't know everything best back here in terms of how to implement or how states should be implementing. States should have the latitude to implement a registration system that works with the state's geography, with their IT infrastructure, with their election funding, other limitations that they may have. Forcing states to allow ballot harvesting. This is another area of S1 that I have a problem with. This practice involves paid campaign operatives going out, collecting ballots, and returning them to be counted. I don't know. I look at this one and see so many ways in which this can be abused and exploited. If a state wants to permit this practice with certain parameters that the state thinks would prevent abuses, that's fine. But not all states should be forced to do so by the federal government and be made subject to DC's idea of what actually works here. Maintaining voter rolls. I think we all want to make sure that voting rolls are current or accurate, but the provisions in S1 really go very far. The bill would require states to secure, quote, objective and reliable evidence. This is a term that's not actually defined in the bill. They have to be able to establish that before removing a voter. What is not considered objective and reliable is a failure to vote or the failure of a voter to respond to a notice sent by the state informing the voter that they've been removed. So you're going to have a situation here where this undefined term will result in people who have long since left a jurisdiction actually remaining on the voter rolls. Then there's the issue of restructuring the Federal Election Commission. From its very inception, this was meant to be a body that was bipartisan to specifically ensure that no political party would grant its candidates an unfair advantage in elections. And so you've got a restructuring that is proposed here that I think presents a flaw. It would reduce the number of seats on the FEC from 6 to 5, 2 members each from the 2 major political parties and 1 ostensible independent. So what this could mean is that a president would simply find someone who would vote in his or her favor each time, but never registered as a member of a particular political party. This newly partisan FEC would also be given the responsibility of handing out loads of cash from the public coffers. I take issue with this, and I think that you've got a fair amount of folks in my state and across the country that do take issue with that as well in terms of public funding. S1 creates a new structure of public financing of campaigns that matches small dollar donations on a 6-to-1 basis. So I look at that, and again, I've got concerns about why anyone thinks it's a good idea to have even more money in politics, but it's easy to me to see how this could be exploited by a partisan board holding the purse strings here. So again, I look at that as a particular example of what are we doing with this in this voting rights bill. I mentioned in my introduction here that I feel that you have many provisions in this measure that are likely unconstitutional. To start, while Congress has broad authority to regulate the times, places, and manner of congressional elections, our powers are much more limited in how a state chooses to appoint its electors to the Electoral College. There, we may only determine the time of choosing electors and the day on which they should give their votes. So every provision that purportedly changes state laws regarding how a state chooses its electors could face significant and I think justified challenges in court. There are numerous provisions which try to criminalize speech that is almost certainly protected. Even the ACLU opposed several parts of this bill on the grounds that it would unconstitutionally limit the speech of citizens, as well as compel speech, neither of which are acceptable. Just 2 years ago, the Fourth Circuit invalidated a law that was nearly identical to a provision that was contained in this bill. Another issue is the issue of tax returns and whether or not Congress can mandate candidates for president to release their tax returns. I think it's only reasonable that they should do so. But the concern that I have is that the Constitution is really pretty clear in outlining the requirements to be president, and releasing tax documents is not one of those. So it just kind of presents a challenge there. Can we direct that? There's an issue. Requiring states to create redistricting commissions may also be constitutional, since Congress cannot coerce or commandeer the mechanisms of state government. Congress also likely doesn't have the authority to require states to permit convicted felons to vote, or the ability to impose an ethics code on the justices of the Supreme Court. So while these may be good ideas, is the constitutional authority there? I think there is real question to that. So, Madam President, my concern, and I'm coming to the end of my comments here, my concern about this measure is that, while the title is strong, for the people, I'm not certain that this measure will do what those who have hoped that it would do will do. It will make administering elections more difficult, more expensive, subject to federal micromanagement. Again, I mentioned the issue of questions of constitutionality and whether aspects of it will be thrown out. Passing this into law could result in messy litigation that leaves the state of election law uncertain for years to come. I've mentioned my concern about one size fits all that is challenging. We're a pretty amazing 50 states, but we're all a little bit unique. But how states have leeway or latitude in determining what works, I think, is important. So I recognize that we are at a place and a time when credibility and faith in our institutions is at a really weak moment, a very weak moment. And so when we think about the things that are core to our institutions, one of those fundamentals is the fairness of our elections. And so ensuring that we are taking an approach in this nation where all people feel that the election process is for them as equal and fair as it is for their neighbor down the street or their their fellow American all the way across the country. How we are able to deliver on this promise is something that we need to continue to strive towards. So I'm going to continue to work on voting rights reform, and I'm going to be doing that through the template of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Americans need to have faith in our institutions. They need to know that our elections are fair, that they are easy and accessible for all. And we can't instill that trust with a wholly partisan effort. So we've got some work to do. We've got a lot of work to do, and it's important work. So I thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.